at all. One persisting, interesting idea about consciousness, or at least perhaps unconscious mental activity during sleep, has to do with the possibility of sleep learning. It has long been the dream of students that somehow they could master course material and other kinds of things during sleep, perhaps by playing, in the old days, records or tapes. These days, playing some kind of digital file while they're asleep, and they'd polish up their French, Spanish vocabulary or something like that. As I say, the idea here goes back a long ways. First formal study of sleep learning was published by E.L. Thorndike, who's a famous learning theorist, during basically in the run-up to World War I, training Army and Navy recruits to learn Morse code, which was how radio communications were done pretty much at that time. And what Thorndike arranged to do was to play a record with letter Morse code combinations: A, da-da, B, da, did it, C, da-da, did, or whatever it is, over and over and over again to these recruits while they slept in the barracks at night. This is back when the Army still had barracks. And what Thorndike observed was that, in fact, the recruits who got the record of letter Morse, the pairs played to them at night, did in fact learn Morse code faster than a control group that didn't. But what he also observed was that these recruits were very tired in the morning. Okay, and it led him to think that far from being sleep learning that these that people were going through, what they were actually engaging in, they were staying awake and engaged in the surreptitious practice. A more interesting study after World War II by Fox and Robbins, this was just at the beginnings of the Cold War, sought to teach military recruits some Chinese, and what they did there was to pair oral Chinese and English words in a kind of paired associate learning procedure. So one group got these Chinese-English word pairs presented to them during sleep. Another one got just music played to them during sleep. That was the control condition. Interestingly, Fox and Robbins observed that the group that got the Chinese-English word pairs presented to them during sleep actually showed savings in learning this material during daytime practice sessions. So before about 1952, these were the two big studies, one that gave very ambiguous evidence, the Thorndike the study, very ambiguous evidence for sleep learning, the Fox and Robbins one giving more positive evidence. Here is actually, this is the data from the Fox and Robbins study, and what you can see here is these are subjects who were presented overnight with the correct Chinese-English pairs. This is the music control group. This is the group that was presented with actually incorrect Chinese-English word pairs. And what you can see here is a lovely learning effect, so that getting the correct pairs presented at night produced savings in relearning those same correct pairs. During the day, music having essentially no effect, nighttime presentation of the incorrect pairs actually interfered with daytime learning. So that's really quite a lovely experiment. The only problem with this is that these kinds of studies, of which the Thorndike and the Fox and Robbins study are pretty good exemplars, did not use modern techniques for guaranteeing that the subjects who were ostensibly learning during sleep were actually asleep. Both of these studies were done before the advent of psychophysiological monitoring of sleep, polysomnography, raising the question again of whether these subjects had actually been learning during the time they were asleep, or whether they were learning while they were awake. So what happens next in the early 1950s is that two investigators, Simon and Evans, began to review this literature again, and also conduct a new set of studies in which they added this psychophysiological criterion of sleep. The criterion they used was the disappearance of alpha activity in the EEG. Okay, that's a standard definition for the onset of sleep. Remember what I told you last time, which was that as you're falling asleep, there's first an increase in alpha activity as the person's arousal levels diminish, and then there's a disappearance of alpha activity basically as the person enters stage 1. You can talk about the appearance of K complexes, you can talk about the appearance of spindle waves and all of that, but it's the disappearance of alpha activity in the EEG that is the standard criterion for somebody who's actually fallen asleep. So the first thing that Simon and Emmons did was to take what the relatively little amount of research that was available at the time that had actually classified people by sleep stages and looked at the amount of learning. Okay, so this is basically percent of items learned. When subjects are awake, they do pretty well, learning about 90% of the items. In descending stage 1 with high levels of alpha activity in the EEG, again, learning is pretty good. Descending stage 1 with moderate levels of alpha activity, worse learning, but still not bad. Descending stage 1 with low levels of alpha activity, again, the learning here is quite poor now. And when you get to stages 2, 3, and 4, where there's no alpha activity in the EEG, by definition, in these latter stages of sleep, there was basically very little learning at all. So here we have in green reports that they actually heard the material, some kind of recall of the material, very poor. Recognition, a little bit better, but again, that could just be a kind of guessing. So again, kind of plotting this activity from this relationship from a formal study that Simon and Emmons did. If they recorded the amount of alpha activity in the EEG following the presentation of each item that the subject was supposed to learn, and if there was alpha activity within 10 seconds of the item, then there was pretty good learning. If there was no alpha activity, the learning was really quite bad, leading to perhaps the most famous and enduring conclusion in all of this literature, which is that, this is a quote, "Sleep learning is possible to the extent that the subject remains awake." Okay? And that's pretty much the way this has worked out so far. If the person is genuinely asleep, where sleep is defined by the absence of alpha activity in the EEG, sleep learning just doesn't seem to occur at all. This does not prevent people from marketing sleep learning tapes for various purposes. You can buy them in the drugstore. You can see them in the advertisements in the back of magazines and newspapers. My favorite of this are subliminal suggestion sleep learning tapes for people who want to lose weight or stop smoking or whatever. And the idea is you play this subliminal suggestion tape while you're asleep. And it turns out, A, there's nothing on the tape, right? Because these subliminal suggestion things don't work at all. And B, you're asleep. So if you're not processing supraliminal stimuli during sleep, you're not going to be processing subliminal stimuli during sleep either. Note the year in which Simon and Emmons came to this conclusion, mid-50s. This was before the distinction between explicit and implicit memory. Almost all studies of sleep learning have used tests of explicit memory as the measure of sleep learning, whether the subject can recall or recognize the material that was presented during sleep, which raises the now obvious question, which is, well, maybe there's no explicit memory for material presented during sleep, but maybe there's implicit memory for material presented during sleep. There is reason for thinking that that is the case. If you think back to this Fox and Robbins study, savings in relearning is actually a measure of implicit memory. You don't have to have conscious recall of anything to show savings in relearning. There's a famous experiment by Tom Nelson at the University of Washington showing that subjects can show savings in relearning from material that they neither recall nor recognize. So looking at the Fox and Robbins study, you might say, well, maybe you can get something like this. Maybe you can get sleep learning so long as you test the learning implicitly. Okay. This was what another sleep researcher, James Wood, did. He actually tested this hypothesis. As far as I know, this is the only study of this kind. Hint, hint, for those of you who ever get access to a sleep learning laboratory. What Wood did, Wood's now at the University of Texas, El Paso, and he doesn't really do much sleep research anymore. He's a clinical psychologist who's gone on to other kinds of things. But taking a leaf from an earlier classic experiment by Eric Ike, what Wood did was to present subjects with homophones, paired associates consisting of a homophone, like peace, paired with a disambiguating word. I showed you an experiment just like this earlier by Eric Ike, in which Ike was able to show that in a dichotic listening situation, that even though subjects were not aware of these pairs being presented over the unattended channel, they still showed a priming effect on a spelling test. So night one, what he did was to present subjects with homophone pairs such as war, peace, and tortoise, hare, and then in the morning he gave the subjects a spelling test, dictated words out loud like peace and hare, and asked them to spell the words. The test is, will the subject spell the words in accordance with the disambiguating context that was presented to them while they were asleep. On the second night, this is a 2-night experiment, he presented them with category instance pairs of the form metal gold or animal horse. And again, in the morning, he gave them a category generation task in which they were asked to generate instances of categories like metals or animals or whatever. And the test of priming is, would they produce the words that had been paired with the cues the night before? Wood, being a good modern sleep researcher, carefully monitored his subjects for any signs of arousal. If there were body movements within a short period of time after the presentation of each of these words, he threw that word out. If there was any evidence of EEG alpha in the alpha activity in the EEG, threw that one out. Slow rolling eye movements as well. All of these are physiological signs of arousal. And he took a great deal of care to make sure that by all standard psychophysiological criteria, the subjects were not asleep, were not awake when these items were presented. So this is what you get, okay? This is the homophone, the priming. When subjects went through this experience awake, you see a nice priming effect here, but when the subjects got the same material while they were sleeping, you see no priming effect at all. And for category instance priming, the same thing. If subjects are presented with the material while they're awake, you get a nice category priming effect, but while they're sleeping, you get nothing at all. So again, it seems to be the case from the evidence of the Wood study that sleep learning is again